So how do you deal with, or how do you prepare for a scenario where maybe the who isn't crystal clear, or traditionally all the content on your site was written from the inside out. It was what we do, who we are, what problems we solve, not so much from an empathetic perspective. And how do you bring empathy to a company who's never had empathy with their content?
That's a really good question. How do you bring empathy to a company that hasn't had empathy with their client, for the customers? First off, I think they're lucky to have made it this far if they never had empathy for their customers. But I
Right.
think the conversation starts a little bit earlier than that too, with the dialogue between a user persona versus a buyer persona. When they were building their product out, when they were designing the UI, the UX of it, and doing the research on the user flows through their app, they built a user persona. Now, bits of that should be translating over to the buyer persona. Now, obviously, these can sound like synonyms that are interchangeable, but the difference here is that your users are not your buyers. We see this especially in B2B, where a purchasing manager or a purchasing officer might make a large bulk purchase of equipment like a computer or a piece of software, but they're not the final users. But for marketers, we can take learnings from that user persona that our design team or research team may have built and use them to minimize the number of assumptions that we have as marketers while we build out our buyer persona. Now, the key to building empathy when you're building a new content strategy for your website isn't to have all the question marks answered, it's to have as little of them as possible and iterate on that buyer profile as you go. So work with what you have on user persona. And then as you start talking to one customer, two, four, eight customers, start filling more of those blanks as you talk to more people. But obviously there's situations where startups may not have access to a large customer base. In situations like that, I definitely encourage them to peek over the fence at their neighbors and see what they're doing or how they're talking about this problem. More specifically, I encourage them to look into the tone of voice and language that their customers might use. So a great way, Jeff, that I would encourage your audience to do this is perhaps to scan social media comments, watch YouTube videos in those comment section as well, and maybe even scan the first page of Google to see what are those keywords and language that those customers may be using,